This video is brought to you by Sailrite. Visit Sailrite.com for all your project supplies, tools, and instructions. In this video, we'll show you how to reupholster a cushion that is stapled to a backer board with a foam ridge along the lip of the seat cushion. This contoured foam ridge helps to support the individual, cupping them snugly into the seat by lifting their legs slightly, thus reducing lumbar strain. How is this type of seat cushion made? Well, it is usually two separate sections of seating foam, the front foam being slightly higher or thicker than the back foam. Because of the contoured shape, the two different heights of foam, a simple fabric cover cannot be employed, since the fabric would just hang loose between the varying heights of foam. To resolve that issue, a fabric pole is sewn in the inside of the cushion between the two layers of foam. Then it is stapled under tension to the backer board. Now the cushion cover is pulled between the two varying heights of foam, giving it a great contoured look. If you have a cushion with varying heights of foam inside that's attached to a backer board, watch this video to see how to reupholster it. The steps included in this video will be gluing new foam and cutting it to size. How to pattern the new foam for the new fabric cover. How to sew piping, if desired, onto the pieces. How to easily baste and then sew the contoured fabric pieces together, and a few tricks to make it easier to sew around corners. And then how to sew in a fabric pole and staple it to the backer board to give the cushion a contoured look. Then we'll staple the new cushion cover over the foam to the backer board on the back side. And if there are any wrinkles in a few spots, we'll show you how to use a heat gun to work those wrinkles out of the vinyl. And finally, on the back side of the backer board, we'll staple on a mesh fabric to give it a finished look there too. Let's get started and show you how to make this cushion. We've already removed the staples on our old cushion. It included a fabric backing on the backer board. It's a mesh fabric, and it includes the backer board and some foam inside that is very much deteriorated and molding. And then on the top side, the vinyl is not in good shape. In fact, the seam is pulled apart at the one junction, and that has caused the foam to sink in that area. So the foam and also the fabric should be replaced. The foam in front of this cushion was larger, and here you can see the fabric pole that was used and stapled to the backer board to pull the cover fabric down in between the foam. We'll be using the old foam to pattern and cut new foam, and we'll be using the cover material as a reference to make the new cover for the new foam. We'll take some pictures so that when we tear it apart we can still remember how it was constructed. We have opted to repattern the new foam, but if you have not opted to do that, before tearing apart your old cushion cover, place match-up marks on the seams at various locations so that you know exactly where panels should be sewn together when you make the new panels from the old panels. Every panel that's matched up to a secondary panel should have a match-up mark going from one panel to the adjacent panel. Sometimes more than one is used on a panel. If you choose to use the old fabric as a pattern for the new fabric, you need to make sure the old cover fits well over the foam. And if you're making new foam, you need to make sure that it too may fit well over the new foam, which actually may be a different size and thickness than your old foam. You can either rip out the stitches or the thread that holds each one of these panels in place, or cut along the seam line. This cushion includes piping, so we're trying to be careful to cut as close to the piping as possible. It's always a good idea to keep each of the panels cut out so that they are intact. Our contoured cushion has 4 panels, 2 boxing panels, and 1 top plate, and a forward boxing panel. So we are going to cut each one of those out as close to the piping and then determine the seam allowance based on where we cut. Here all of the panels are cut out. Now we need to reference each one of the marks with letters so we do not get confused. A, B, C, D, E, F, however many marks you placed to join panels together. At the marks, those panels should be sewn together or basted together, then sewn, starting at the marks and then working around the perimeter. As already mentioned, we'll be cutting new foam and making patterns to fit that new foam and using those to cut out our new material. So before we can do that, we need to cut the foam to size. We'll be using the old foam to cut out the new foam. Did you know that gluing foam pieces together to add to the thickness or even the width or length is common? Here we're using our foam lock spray adhesive to glue 2 sheets of a high density polyurethane foam together. This will equal 3 inches. We have a 2-inch sheet and a 1-inch sheet. We are applying the spray glue to both surfaces that will be bonded together to make the 2-inch and 1-inch foam 3 inches in thickness. You'll find a large selection of foams at the Sailrite website in various lengths, widths, and thicknesses, also different density levels and firmness levels. Even though the old foam from the cushion has compressed slightly and it's also in very bad shape, it has a lot of mold in it, the width and the length should be pretty much the same. So we're going to trace around it onto the new foam that we just glued together. This foam is 3 inches thick. The foam in front for the lip is 1 inch thicker at 4 inches. This foam is compressed not only on the top but on the sides as well. So I'm holding the marker at 90 degrees. We'll check to see if it fits well with the other foam after it's been cut out. To cut the foam, we're using the Sailrite blade foam saw. It has a base that keeps our cut nice and straight. If you don't have that, you can use an electric kitchen knife to cut the foam. The majority of the OEM boats, when they're manufactured, use a polyurethane foam. Usually it's not a high-density polyurethane foam, but a medium to low-density polyurethane foam. We recommend using a high-density polyurethane foam, which Sailrite stocks. The backer board that we're going to reuse is not in perfect shape. It already has a vinyl that's been stapled around the edges, and this vinyl has a foam backing. It's actually a headliner vinyl. This vinyl has been stapled onto the sharp edges along the forward and side edges to help protect the vinyl that will eventually be used as our cover when it's wrapped around those sharp edges and stapled onto the backer board. Let's make sure that foam fits onto our backer board. We want the edges of the foam to extend approximately a 1/2 inch over the backer board, which they do. Before we place the lipped portion along the front, we need to mark where the 3-inch foam rests. In other words, where the 4-inch will come up against the 3-inch foam. So we're just using a pencil or anything to mark the backer board at that location. This 2-inch plus 1-inch equaling 3-inch foam, which has been glued together, fits perfectly on the backer board. But the 4-inch thickness foam does not. It has too much foam at the edge here and also along the forward edge. The 4-inch height is exactly what we want, but we do not need any excess foam along the edges. It should be flush with the 3-inch foam. So we're going to cut away the excess. We're going to take our marker and mark how much should be cut away along the outer edge and the forward edge. The cushion has been placed upside down, the backer board's on top, so we're marking the underside of the foam around the perimeter so it matches up with the 3-inch foam. The base of the foam saw causes this cut area on this very small piece of foam to basically be slanted slightly. So I'm using my one hand to raise the other side of the foam so that it cuts more 90 degrees to the tabletop surface. On larger sheets of foam, that is not a problem. Now it fits almost perfectly. A slight deviation on the sides and the front is not a big deal. Even though we cut apart the old cushion, we're not going to be using it as a pattern to cut the new fabric. Instead, we're going to be using the foam and patterning new patterns so that we can cut the vinyl fabric to size using those patterns we're going to create now. We've laid the top surface or outside surface against the tabletop or against the Durascrim pattern material and are now using a Sharpie marker to trace around the foam. It is important that the pattern material be on the top side of the foam, since that's where the fabric will be placed over top of the foam. Looking at how the old cushion cover was made, this edge of the fabric wraps around the foam and is stapled to the backer board. So we're using the clear acrylic ruler, which is 6 inches in width, and using it to trace 6 inches past the foam so that the fabric can wrap around the edge of the foam and wrap around the backer board and be stapled to it. The foam thickness here is 3 inches, so 6 inches would give us 3 extra inches to wrap around the backer board. If the foam were thicker, you would want to add more fabric so that it can wrap around the thicker foam and the backer board and be stapled on the back side. These are the only 2 sides that will wrap around the backer board and be stapled to it. The other sides will have pieces that are sewn to them, and those pieces will wrap around the backer board. So now we can cut out our pattern material right on top of the marks that we marked on the pattern material. Once it's cut out, flip the foam to the top surface and label the pattern material outside surface. That way you won't get confused when it comes time to pattern the actual fabric. Top, O, side for outside. Lay that foam on the backer board, being assured of the 1/2 inch around the perimeter. We'll place the riser or ridge foam in its location. Now let's concentrate on the back corner of that top pattern or panel that we just made, and let's pinch the fabric together, making a triangle, and mark at the edge on both sides of the triangle. This will be a square that we cut out of the pattern material, and we will sew those 2 ends together to make this corner. We will use our seam stick for canvas, a 1/4 inch size, and place it along the facing or boxing edge of the cushion or foam that has not yet been patterned, and run it along the top edge of the 3-inch foam and the 4-inch foam all the way around. We'll be using this to stick our pattern material around the perimeter of the cushion where pattern material does not yet exist. Having a run of double-sided tape will make it easy to create a pattern for the remainder of this cushion. The transfer paper from the double-sided tape has been removed, revealing the glue. We have pre-cut some Durascrim pattern material into a very long rectangle, long enough to go all the way around the cushion. And now we will base that around the perimeter of the cushion with its straight bottom edge up against the tabletop. The strip must be cut so it's wide enough to go past the upper edge of your cushion assembly. If you have any wrinkles, it's easy to remove it from the double-sided tape and rebaste it in place. You'll notice there's a slight wrinkle here at the front. So what we'll do is we will unbaste it and work out that wrinkle and rebaste it around the assembly. We do not need to pattern for the back edge because the top panel has fabric that wraps around the back edge and then is stapled to the backer board. And now that the Durascrim pattern material is held in place with the double-sided tape, we'll take our Sharpie marker and start marking the edges of the foam, including the corners like we just marked. So here we're marking the top edge of the 3-inch foam, and then the transition up to the 4-inch foam or riser. Our design calls for 2 panels to be sewn together along the front. So we will draw a gentle curve here, indicating where this panel will be sewn to another facing or boxing strip. Now we have the top panel and one of the side panels completed. Now we've moved to the back corner on the opposite side, and we've patterned a line there at that corner, and we will trace around the edge of the foam here as well. This will be a separate panel from the front panel. So here is a line indicating where this panel will be sewn together to the front panel, or what we want to call boxing or facing strip. And we will mark the top edge just like we did on the previous panel. While we're patterning here at 90-degree turns like this one and any other 90-degree turn, it's typically wise to make a gentle curve so it transitions nicely and sews easily. We'll be doing that later on when it comes time to pattern the actual fabric. But for now, for the patterns, they're just 90-degree turns. Now we can remove this strip of fabric. We have not yet patterned for the panel that lays between them, for it will include not only the front facing or boxing strip, but it will include the top portion of the 4-inch riser. Once this panel is removed with those two panels patterned, we will cut those two patterns out and rebaste them to the foam at the appropriate locations. Rounding the 90-degree turns will be done later on, so at this point we're just going to cut directly on top of the lines that we struck on the pattern material. And now that they're cut out, we'll rebaste them to the edge of the foam at the appropriate locations. Now we'll place Durascrim pattern material on the area that has not yet been patterned, and we will smooth it out so that there are no wrinkles and everything is laying nice and flat. And then we'll take our Sharpie marker and mark around the perimeter of this. We will mark along the edge of the riser here at this location. Don't worry about the 1-inch transition down to the 3-inch foam. We will not pattern for that. We will just mark the top edge. Unfortunately, we forgot to film some of the matchup marks. Here we just labeled a B indicating a mark where it will join up to the front panel below. And you can see on the left-hand side there's an A with a matchup mark there where that panel will be joined up with the top panel. Matchup marks are very important. You can place them anywhere you'd like. Typically near the center location is best, and you can place as many as you want on the panel. Just make sure you label them so you know exactly where they should fall. That will help when it comes time to baste and sew each of the panels together. Don't forget to label each panel outside. We'll be marking an O.S. for that. This matchup mark was labeled C to match up with the matchup mark on the top one labeled C. You may be asking, what about seam allowance? Well, we'll discuss that next after we baste this panel we just made to our foam. We will only add a 1/2-inch seam allowance to the ridge or riser portion of the cushion on both panels that are joined at this location. We will not add any other seam allowance. Yes, I know, seam allowance is typically added to most canvas sewing projects, and it would seem logical that it would be added to all seams on this cushion, but that is not done. Why? Well, when stapling the cushion cover over the foam to the backer board, we will apply a lot of tension, and this will compress the foam. If we added seam allowance, the cover may be too large and not fit snugly over the compressed foam. So the cushion cover is actually built slightly smaller. So only add a 1/2-inch seam allowance to the ridge seam on both panels, and that's it. Patterning of the foam is done. Now we can use those to pattern the actual vinyl fabric. Our vinyl fabric's outside surface is facing the tabletop, and we have nested the pattern pieces over it with their outside surfaces facing down. In other words, the writing is upside down on the pattern material. This is the ridge seam, and here we've labeled the pattern material a 1/2-inch. So we're striking a line a 1/2-inch away from the edge of the pattern material for seam allowance. Here again is a ridge seam, so it is marked a 1/2-inch away from the pattern material at that location. We're using the clear acrylic ruler to mark the pattern material. Now here we're just using the clear acrylic ruler to keep the pattern material from moving as we mark along the edge of the pattern material there. The bottom edges of each panel are labeled staple. That's where we'll have excess fabric that wraps around to the backerboard and it is stapled together at those locations. Extra fabric at those staple locations is wise to pull around the backerboard and staple down. Don't forget to label each one of the matchup marks on your vinyl material or whatever fabric you're using for the cushion cover. Those are very important. This is the other panel that has a seam along the riser or ridge, so it too has a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now everywhere else, it's basically right on top of the pattern material, except along any edge that's labeled staple, in other words bottom edge. There you may want to leave excess fabric. It'll make it easier to pull the cushion cover around the backerboard and tension it well as you staple. Don't forget to label all matchup marks. It's also wise to label them with the reference number or letter that you designated for each matchup mark. When patterning, we talked about making gentle curves at sharp turns. We have not yet done that on our vinyl material, but we will do that after we've patterned around all of our patterns. Our contoured cushion includes piping, so we need to look at the old cushion cover to determine where the piping should be sewn onto each of the panels. By careful study, you can see that the piping was sewn onto the 2 facing or boxing strips, and it was sewn onto the top plate. Here's another boxing strip it was sewn onto. So we will go back to our pattern material and label it P with an arrow indicating the direction that the piping would be sewn onto each one of those panels.
Make sure you designate that it's going
P
over the
for
top of
piping, and the arrow indicates how it will start and stop. Our patterning on our vinyl or a cushion cover fabric is complete. We just want to inspect it carefully and make changes if required. For instance, here's a line that we didn't mean to make, so we'll place X's on it. At sharp turns, it's difficult to sew, and they also don't typically look so good on contoured cushions, in our opinion. So we will turn them into gentle curves. These gentle curves are shown with blue lines here in this illustration. This illustration also has panels in the appropriate position of how they would be sewn to each other. When we did the patterning on the actual fabric, they were nested randomly. You may have noticed in our illustration that some turns that were sharp were redrawn with gentle curves and others were not. Why is that? Well, let's take a look at the drawing again and hopefully we can explain it. These corners, shown in the green circle, will be sewn directly across from each other, just extending the plane of that edge after they are sewn. That also goes with any bottom edge that needs to be stapled. It will not have a curve. So after these 2 panels are sewn together, you can see the edges are just straightaways. There's no need for curve. Hopefully that will explain exactly what you need to do with your contoured cushion. If after patterning you still have questions about what corners should have gentle curves and which should not, you can always email a picture of your patterns to Sailrite. We'd be glad to help. After all the appropriate corners have been rounded, it is time to cut the fabric out. We're using a vinyl fabric, and we've drawn on the back side of this vinyl fabric. Be sure to use a high-quality marine vinyl fabric available from Sailrite. Cheap vinyls are not worth investing in. When we come to this inside corner, notice we're following the gentle curve that we drew and not the 90-degree turn. Here at the bottom edge, this is a straightaway, so we'll cut directly across. No curve is needed there. Remember when patterning we made a triangle shape and drew 2 lines. That's what we're cutting out here. Basically that triangle that we had at the extreme corner of the top plate. Our cushion includes piping. That is completely optional. We're going to sew a prefabricated piping onto the panels. As we discussed previously, piping will be added to 3 of our panels, shown here with the dark blue lines. Adding piping is completely up to the end user. It is optional. Here's one of the smaller panels. You'll notice the P with the arrows indicating where the piping should be sewn on. We need to sew the piping on the outside surface along that outer edge. I like to leave a tail of approximately 1 to 2 inches underneath of the portion that will be stapled to the backer board. A cording foot has been installed on the Sailrite fabricator sewing machine to sew this piping in place. At this curve, we create some slits in the flange of the piping. This allows the piping to take the curve more smoothly. This is an outside curve. Slits are all that's required here. Notice that we go very slowly when we sew into this corner, and at times we will bury the needle and lift our foot and pivot or turn our assembly. Then we'll lower the foot and we'll continue to sew. We want to try to sew right next to the piping. Notice the cuts did not go so deep into the piping that they will be visible when the cushion is turned right side out. We do not want to cut too deeply into any of the corners. Now we're reaching the portion of the cushion that takes another slight turn. Here, a relief notch will be made so that the piping can take that turn. Sometimes the piping flange needs to stretch, and other times it needs to shrink. Here in this application, it needs to shrink up. So what we'll do is we'll not just make a notch, we will cut out a triangle into that flange. That allows the piping to collapse at the flange to take this inward turn. We will continue to sew until we reach the next outer curve or corner. And remember, we cut away the 90-degree corners and made them gradual curves. That makes sewing easier, and we believe the cushion looks better when the fabric is pulled tightly around the foam. Here's another outside turn. It only needs a slit because the flange needs to stretch or expand at that outside turn. When we reach the bottom edge where it will be stapled to the backer board, we will cut the piping about 1 inch longer than the bottom edge of our fabric application. There we go. We sewed past that edge about 1 inch and cut the piping. Now we're repeating that process on another panel. The Sailrite fabricator sewing machine set up in the workhorse servo motor gives you optimal slow speed control and power. Not that we need power for this final application, but slow speed control is nice. It's also set up with a 1/4 inch cording foot, so it has a tunnel that will feed the piping nicely through the presser foot. At this outside corner, we made 3 slits, which allows the piping to expand as it takes the outside curve. We'll follow this procedure for all 3 of the panels that calls for piping. Let's move on. Now we need to sew those panels together. We will transfer some of our match-up marks to the top side in the flange of the piping or at the edge of the fabric if you have no piping. When sewing vinyl together, you do not have to use double-sided tape. However, with contoured cushions like this, we do believe for DIYers that it's extremely helpful. Here we're applying 1/4 inch basting tape or seam stick for canvas along the flange of the piping, keeping the double-sided tape as far away from the actual cording of the piping as possible. This way the glue will not show up after the cushion's been sewn and turned right side out. The top panel is on the bottom side with its outside surface facing up, and the adjacent panel is on top of that with its outside surface facing down. We have basted it together at the match-up mark. In other words, it's mark C for us. And we will baste it around the perimeter here. The top plate takes a very sharp turn here for this panel. So watch what we do here. At the corner, we will take our scissors and cut a few slits at the corner location, going no deeper than about 1/4 inch, for our seam allowance is 1/2 inch. We do not want to slit into the actual stitch that we will be creating. The fabric, which was flat, is now taking a 3D shape. So lifting it off the table as you baste makes it easier to baste those two shapely assemblies together. You'll notice the ends are not matched up perfectly. Don't worry about that at this point. We'll be trimming them if necessary with adjacent panels that are basted and sewn into this. Now we'll take these two panels over and sew them. Notice that we're sewing right next to the piping, again with our cording foot installed on the Sailrite Fabricator sewing machine. When we get to the portion of the cushion that takes a rather sharp turn here, even though we've cut a gradual curve into it, we'll have to go very slowly here. And sometimes we'll take our scissors and cut a few more relief slits in the fabric so that it can more easily take the shapely turn. Here the fabric has become slightly unbasted from the corner, and we're just cutting a few more slits in the fabric. Then we'll rebaste it with our fingers and then continue to sew at that area. We bury our needle so we don't lose our position in the fabric as we manipulate the fabric to go around this turn. Because we use double-sided tape, we can kind of baste those panels together prior to sewing, even when we're here at this very shapely turn. It is also very important to make sure that the bottom fabric on the underside is not wrinkled as you sew. If it is wrinkled, it will show up when the cover is turned right side out. So make sure the fabric on the underside feels like there are no wrinkles as you sew it. These two panels are sewn together. We have two more to sew to it. Here we're applying the double-sided tape 1/4 inch seam stick for canvas on the flange of the piping of this panel. On the bottom side of our fabric we have the match-up marks. We'll transfer those marks to the top side of the fabric, not going deeper than our seam allowance. Then we'll take the adjacent panel so outside surfaces are facing each other, and we will start at one of the match-up marks. Here we're going to start at the match-up mark labeled B. When we sewed the first two panels together, one of the ends was not perfectly lined up. We said don't worry about it. Here we're going to show you what we do about that situation. So here we're just using office clamps just to basically temporarily hold the panel in place to show you the excess fabric and what to do with it. There is a smooth transition at each one of the office clamps, but there's excess fabric between the office clamps on the panel that's closest to me. So taking a pencil here, we'll scribe a line where we need to cut off the excess fabric. Our goal here is to remove the excess fabric, making a smooth transition from the points that do match up. That means we're also going to have to cut the excess piping off as well. Not a big deal. Even though you've patterned everything, this still has to match up well, and if you were to match it up as it was existing now, you'd have a hole in the middle of your cushion, so this step needs to be taken. Do not think that this will screw up your entire cushion. It will not. It will actually come out beautiful just this way. So again, we need to cut the piping right along that edge, and now we have a smooth transition between B and A. We really did not need to use the office clamps. We could have just started basting with one of the match-up marks directly on top of themselves, basted the fabric together, making a smooth transition, and then cut away the excess. As we move to B here, you'll notice that B is not directly on top of the match-up mark underneath it. That is nothing to worry about. Remember, this shapely cushion has a lot of curves and transitions and high foam pieces. It will be pulled over the cushion material and stapled to the backer board, so it will typically have a great fit, even though this match-up mark was not perfectly on top of the other. Now we'll continue basting from A out. So here we have a gentle curve. We've cut some relief slits into the fabric underneath, and we lift that fabric off the tabletop because it's starting to take a 3D dimension, and it's much easier to baste panels off of the tabletop when they do that. And any ruffle in the fabric or wrinkle in the fabric, we can cut relief slits at those locations to allow the fabric to rest at that curve or transitional spot. Do not cut deeper than 1/4 inch into the edge of the fabric. We do not want to see the slit after the 1/2 inch seam allowance is sewn in. Now the two panels is being joined by a third panel, taking it to the sewing machine and sewing right next to the welting or cording, using the cording foot on the fabricator. And here when we get to the curve, we need to make sure that we keep that stitch up against the cording. Make sure the fabric on the underside has no wrinkles in it, especially when it gets to a curve like this. We want to make sure that fabric's resting flatly on the bed of the sewing machine as we sew it at that location. If you need to make adjustments, try to bury your needle and make adjustments with the needle buried so you don't lose your stitch position. Here we're coming to that piping that we are going to sew over. We will fold the tail to the direction that it wants to rest and make sure that it lays flat and sew very slowly over the piping, joining this panel to the adjacent two panels, and we'll continue to sew. And here's another corner. We approach it slowly. We make sure the fabric on the underside has no wrinkles or puckers, and we sew around the perimeter right next to the piping. Now, if you are not close enough to the piping, you can always go back and re-stitch at the corners. So we will inspect the corners after we're done sewing this assembly to see if we sewed close enough to the piping. Now we never want to sew through the piping because obviously then you'd have a needle hole and a stitch that you'd have to remove. But don't worry, if you feel like you're a little bit far from the piping, you can always correct. No one sees those stitches. They're on the inside of the cushion cover. So let's inspect it now. We turn it right side out and we'll inspect to see if our stitch is close enough to the piping. Here it is not. Notice that we are a little bit far from that edge, so we will re-stitch it there. Let's see what that transition is when we had to sew over the piping. It looks great. And the second corner, it looks great. We do not have to re-stitch it. So only one corner. So we'll stick that back in the sewing machine and re-stitch that so that stitch is closer to the piping or cording. To re-sew a corner, just start about 3 to 4 inches away from the corner. No need to really do any reversing since you're starting away from the corner and sewing through previous stitches. And sew around that corner again, keeping your stitch closer to the piping this time. Then when you reach the straightaway again, simply sew about 2 inches away from the corner and then just sew outside the edge. That way you don't have to do any reversing, just like we did here. You'll notice those panels that we just sewed together have another transition that has to have the last panel sewn onto it that is not perfectly straight. In other words, it doesn't go straight across from panel to panel. So again, we're using our office clamps just as an example of what we're going to do. However, you could just baste it in place and then just trim off the excess, smoothing out the transition from panel to panel. So here we're just taking a pencil and doing what we could do by just basting it together and then using scissors to trim this away. So this is some excess. That kind of situation happens when you're sewing something like this, even though you did patterning. Don't let it alarm you. So now we have a smooth transition from one sewn panel to the next. Now we can start basting it together. Again, we're applying the 1/4 inch basting tape for canvas. Even though this is vinyl, we like to use this because it has a good sticking power, and we're basting it on the flange of the piping of the last panel. We match up the matchup marks. Outside surfaces should be facing each other, so we need to flip this panel. We'll transfer the matchup mark on the bottom side to the top side. Outside surfaces of these panels are facing each other. The D matchup mark is directly on top of the opposite D matchup mark. Our transition, which has been trimmed, is nice. And now we need to work around this corner, so we'll cut some slits, just like we did with the other panels that we showed previously. And now, since we have a 3D shape, we lift the fabric off the table to baste around that corner, matching up the raw edges as we baste. There are quite a few wrinkles from the transitional shape here, so we will cut slits to relax the fabric at those locations. Same procedure for the other corner and for sewing this assembly together. We're going to go through this rather quickly since the process is done in exactly the same way that we've shown. The fabric pole that pulls the fabric between the two layers of foam has not yet been installed. That can be done now while you're sewing the panels together, or it can be done afterwards. We're going to show it now, after everything's been sewn together. The fabric pole will go between the two varying thicknesses of foam. We will use the smallest thickness for our fabric pole calculations. The length of the fabric pole has to be the length of the seam plus at least 12 inches. Then it needs to be the thickness of the foam times 2. Our foam is 3 inches, so that's 6 inches. And then the line that we strike on it needs to be the thickness of the foam, the smallest foam, 3 inches, plus the seam allowance, so 3.5 inches. Typically, scrap fabric is used for a fabric pole or stretcher, as it is sometimes called. We're using Rocklon Econo Sheen, which is very inexpensive for the fabric pole. The fabric pole will be sewn to this seam. At the ends, where we sewed other panels, we have to make a small slit, obviously not going into the stitched line, just to allow the flange, which is about a 1/2 inch, to rest separate from the adjacent panels. Now we will baste that fabric pole onto that small 1/2 inch tail on the underside. Now remember, we talked about how we could have sewn the fabric pole to this assembly as we were sewing this assembly together. We chose not to do that, but if you'd like, you may choose to sew that in place as you sew that assembly together. It is your choice. Just make sure the fabric pole pulls in the right direction to the inside of the cushion cover. The transfer paper of the double-sided tape has been removed, and we will baste the fabric pole to that 1/2 inch flange on the inside of our cushion. Now we do have to go around a curve here, so there'll be a few small wrinkles in the fabric pole, and that's acceptable. Be sure the side of the fabric pole with the measured struck down line is the basted raw edge of that fabric pole. For our application, our smallest foam thickness was 3 inches, so that struck down line is 3.5 inches from the raw edge of the fabric pole. Our fabric pole takes a turn, so here at the turn we're going to slit the fabric down to the middle of that turn. We will not slit any further than the basted area. In other words, we'll stop about 1 inch from the edge of our fabric pole. That will allow the fabric to take the turn as we staple it to the backer board. The fabric pole's been basted on, but we also need to sew it, so we're going to take it to the sewing machine. The fabric pole's on the bottom side. Now we need to sew into the 1/2 inch flange, or we need to sew right next to that welting again. We do not want to sew through the welting. Here we're sewing right next to the welting, and we are about 1 inch from the starting point of this cushion where the fabric pole will be sewn on, which is completely fine. You don't have to start right at the beginning. Now here we fell off of the piping because we're not being very careful. So for a portion of this, we're actually going to sew into that 1/2 inch flange without being next to the piping. But I prefer to have the foot on the piping, so I'll just lift the presser foot and put the piping directly under the tunnel again and sew right on top of those previous stitches. This secures that fabric pole to the bottom side of our assembly. When you come to the end, or when you're sewing the fabric pole on, be sure that you are not accidentally sewing the excess fabric pole that may be folded back. So just make sure it's folded away from where you are stitching. Here there's a little bit of a wrinkle in the fabric, so I pulled the fabric away to inspect it carefully. And then I'll just put it back underneath the presser foot and sew the remainder of that fabric pole in place. Remember, the fabric pole does not need to sit without any wrinkles, but you do not want to create any wrinkles in your actual vinyl cover because they will be visible. So if you want to be assured that you're not going to cause problems, you may not want to sew right next to that piping. You may want to just sew outside the piping into the 1/2 inch flange, which we are doing here because there's a lot of shape there. We don't want to screw up the cushion. And again, we're about 1 inch from the end, and that's close enough. Now we'll do some reversing to lock the stitch in place, and our fabric pole is now sewn on to our cushion cover.
Good, so the rock line's secured.
We're using a high-density polyurethane foam, which, if it gets wet, soaks up water like a sponge and takes a long time to dry out. So we're going to wrap it in a silk film. This will help, doesn't prevent it, it helps to prevent water from getting to the foam, even inside of a vinyl cover, because stitch holes obviously leak. So this also does another thing. It makes it easier for us to insert the foam into the cushion cover. We've also wrapped the 4-inch ridge or riser foam. We didn't show that. The cover's outside surface is facing the tabletop, and here is our fabric pole. We will place the rear portion of the foam, not the riser portion, into the cover first. We believe it's easier to wrap the silk film around the foam so that the folds or excess in the silk film is facing up, so we can control where the flaps sit. Once the foam is in place, be sure the fabric poles are sitting up as best they can, and then we will place the backer board on top of this, sandwiching the foam between the fabric and the backer board. Hopefully, if the cushion cover has been built appropriately, all of the corners on the fabric cover should come in contact with the corners of the backer board. If they do not, you may have to do some investigating to see why. The backer board is about a 1/2 inch from the raw edges of the foam. In other words, the foam is sticking out a 1/2 inch on all edges approximately.
And this point over here.
Now we will tack the back edge in place. This is not permanent. This is only temporary. We will make sure that the corner seams are at the corners of the backer board. Then we'll pull the fabric fairly snugly, compressing the foam slightly. Then we'll insert a staple very close to the raw edge of the fabric with a stapler slightly at an angle so only one leg gets buried deeply into the backer board. The other leg is protruding slightly so that we can easily remove it later on. So we are temporarily stapling the corners and the back edge. This will make it easier for us to staple the fabric pole under tension at the appropriate location in the middle or the inside of our cushion. Once the cover in the rear and the 2 corners in the rear is secured with a few staples, we can turn the board right side up and open up the front portion of the cover to gain access to the fabric pole. And now at the front side of our cushion, we can pull our fabric back, revealing the foam and the fabric pole. Since the fabric's been stapled along the back edge, we basically can apply the fabric pole or staple the fabric pole to the backer board under some tension. Use a sandbag that we fashioned from some leftover fabric to help hold the vinyl fabric out of the way as you staple the fabric pole in place. If you don't have that, use a heavy object. The line that we struck 3.5 inches from the raw edge of the fabric pole is our reference line, and the line that we struck on the backer board is where we want that reference line to be stapled. Here we are starting with that small portion before the curve, stapling it in place directly on top of the line and the line that we struck on the fabric pole. There is not much room here. We're using the Sailrite short nose upholstery staple gun for this application. Striking that line that's 3.5 inches from the raw edge of the fabric pole means that we're going to pull that foam 3 inches down to our backer board. It'll compress the 3-inch only slightly, but it'll compress the 4-inch even more. So having that line and having the line struck on the backer board and assuring that that line is on top of the line we struck on the backer board really gives us constant tension as we pull the fabric pole, applying tension to our vinyl cover even before it's stapled onto the back edge of the backer board. We happen to use some scrap fabric that we can easily see through. You may not be able to see it in the video, but we can see that line from underneath the line that we struck down, which is quite convenient. That isn't a total necessity. I can still lift the fabric pole and basically follow that line that we struck on the backer board. As you staple, push the silk film underneath the foam and in between the backer board. That keeps it out of the way. And don't worry if you accidentally staple through the silk film. It's not a huge big deal. In fact, it's almost impossible not to staple through some of it. But try to avoid it as much as possible. Now, once we have it pretty much generally stapled in place, we will come back and we will place a few more staples in between these staples. So we're stapling about every inch to 2 inches apart, lining up the line as we go. Using the nose of the stapler helps to also apply more tension. So we are pulling on the fabric and then using the nose of the staple gun to apply even more pressure, getting that line directly on top of the line on the backer board. Now we'll come back and staple in between, again applying tension with my fingers and the nose of the staple gun so that we have consistent pull on the fabric pole. Secure the fabric pole all the way to the end of the backer board. Okay, now we're going to take our riser or our ridge foam, which is 4 inches in height, that's been wrapped in the silk film, and place it in front of our back foam. And we will push any excess silk film underneath our foam, between the foam and the backer board. Now we can turn the assembly back over to the backer board side. Now we can start to draw the fabric cover over the backer board and start stapling it in place, being assured that our corners that we're sewing in rest over the corners of the backer board. We like to start in the middle of the opposite side that we stapled down. So we will apply tension, and again we're going to apply staples temporarily. One leg is buried deep and the other is not, so we can easily remove them. Now we'll lift up our piece and look at the top side. Obviously it's not tensioned everywhere, only in that one spot, but it's already looking good. So again, we will start to temporarily staple it in place around the perimeter. If you're confident in the fit, you can go ahead and staple it in place permanently. We like to do this temporary staple just so that we are assured the contoured shape is fitting exactly how we want it. And if we need to make modifications, we can still do so easily by removing the staples and hopefully being able to fix something. So far we like the way it looks. Keeping the staples near the outer edge and holding the stapler at a slight angle makes it easy to remove the staples, as we discussed earlier. Now we are tensioning in the center on the sides. We will eventually tackle the corners, but that's not until we're happy with the fit. When tensioning a cover over foam, we definitely want the cover to compress the foam. That takes out as many wrinkles as possible and makes for a better fitting cover. If there are wrinkles on the top side, and as long as they're fairly small, and you don't like them, don't worry. You can sometimes work some of those out with a heat gun or a blow dryer. We'll show that a little bit later on. There's quite a bit of excess fabric here. However, we have not put it under extreme tension yet, so that's what we're going to do here. But we're also going to have to use a blow dryer or a heat gun and carefully shrink the fabric at that location to pull out most of the wrinkles. It is better, but we still have a few wrinkles. Those will typically be easy to remove. They're not extreme. We will continue to temporarily staple around the perimeter, staying very close to the raw edge of the fabric on the backer board. And when we get to the corners, we will stay about an inch to 2 inches away from each corner, and then we'll inspect our work. We still have excess fabric here, and hopefully we'll be able to work that out with a heat gun or a blow dryer. Before attaching the corners, we will go around the entire perimeter, placing a staple about every ½ inch to a ¼ inch away from each other, very close to the edge of the backer board. Doing this will enable us to cut away the excess fabric on the inside and also remove those temporary staples. So we will do this all around the perimeter. Again, we are staying approximately 2 inches away from each of the corner edges. So we will stop stapling at each corner. Now we will remove the temporary staples using the tack and stapler remover and a pair of needle nose pliers or just standard pliers. And then at each corner we'll use a razor blade or scissors and we will slit the fabric away from the last point where we stapled. So basically 2 inches away from the corner we will make a straight cut so we can take away the excess fabric at all 4 sides of the cushion. So we're cutting the fabric with a razor blade, or you can use scissors all around the perimeter about a ½ inch or so away from the staples that we stapled around the outer perimeter of our backer board. Stapling a corner, especially one with piping, can be slightly difficult. There's always excess fabric at the corners, and sometimes wrinkles cannot be avoided. Cutting slits or cutting portions of the fabric out from the corner can sometimes help, as long as you don't cut past the portion of the cushion that will be visible. Wrinkles or slits or cut out fabric on the underside is no big deal. Nobody sees it there. But on the sides, they will see the wrinkles slightly, so try to work them out as best as you can. There are a few wrinkles here. Some of those wrinkles will come out with a heat gun or a blow dryer or a steamer. There. Now, this back side of the cushion is not going to be visible. In fact, it's going to be pushed under something. So all I'm concerned about are the sides. Even though this back corner will not be visible, I still want it to look fairly good. Once I'm happy with it, I'll staple it in place. Now we have a very large wrinkle here. We can either remove some of the staples or we can push the vinyl fabric down under, kind of distributing that wrinkle or working that wrinkle out as we go. Remember, hardly anyone looks at the back side of a cushion, and we will also be placing a decorative fabric called Fifertex on the back side. I think we're going to put a Fifertex Plus on it. You can also use cushion underlining material to kind of hide all those staples. We still have a few wrinkles on the back side, but most of those can be removed with the heat gun, as we discussed. Now we'll cut away the excess fabric. So again, doing corners is sometimes a little bit difficult. Take your time, work things out. You can cut slits or notches out of the fabric to help it take a corner and staple them in place. And now your cushion cover is done. We still have to work out some of the wrinkles, and we also want to put a decorative fabric on the underside. We're going to show you how to do that next. Next up, we'll show how to remove some wrinkles with a heat gun. Use a heat gun or a blow dryer or a steamer to work wrinkles out. This can be done with vinyl or fabric cover applications. Here you can see this wrinkle, and we're using a heat gun. You do need to be careful when using a heat gun that you do not melt the vinyl to the point where the embossing or the texture of the vinyl melts away. So heat it to a point where the wrinkle is worked out. Slowly take your time and press on the vinyl to feel how hot it is. Be careful not to burn yourself. If it gets too hot, you can actually damage the vinyl. You can see here that the wrinkles are starting to work out. As I press upon the vinyl, you can see them actually getting better and better. Ooh, it's so hot there that I burnt myself, so be careful, it's almost getting too hot. You can already see the wrinkle is almost completely worked out. There's still a little bit, but not much. That is just about perfect. The slight bump under the piping is actually the end of the piping or cording. We will not be able to work that out. Even though the back side of the cushion will not be visible, there are a few wrinkles here. We'll try to work those out as well. Applying heat or steam is not just enough to pull the wrinkles out. You also need to use your hands or fingers to pull or stretch the vinyl in such a way that the wrinkles disappear. Again, do this carefully to not melt the fabric and to not burn yourself. It is amazing what a heat gun or a steamer will do for vinyl and also fabric applications. Up next, we'll be stapling a decorative fabric piece on the backer board. On the underside of our backer board, we will staple on Fabric.min Plus, or we could staple on cushion underlining fabric. First, we need to remove the seating hardware on the bottom of the seat. It will be reinstalled after the fabric is stapled in place. We will simply staple around the perimeter, securing the Fabric.min Plus, or if you've chosen, cushion underlining fabric. This is Fabric.min Plus. Once one side is stapled down, we work to the center of the opposite side and start stapling along that side as well. If you happen to hit another staple, sometimes a staple may not go in all the way. That's no big deal. Typically, we just let them be. After stapling around the perimeter, you can either use a razor blade or a pair of scissors and cut the excess fabric right outside the staples. This helps give the bottom side a finished look, and it also hides some of the raw edges of the fabric that created the cover. We've marked the position of where the hardware goes and are now reassembling the hardware that was on the bottom of the seat cushion. This cushion with a ridge or riser with the fabric pole that pulls it into the foam is now complete. Coming up next is the materials list and the tools that we used to build this cushion. Visit the Sailrite website for high-quality foams that are great for cushions like this. You'll also find many types of different brands and colors and styles of marine-quality vinyls. Also, the Sailrite upholstery staple gun has been specifically designed for upholstery applications. We designed it so the staple would not be buried too deeply into vinyl or fabric applications. Exclusively sold at Sailrite. For more free videos like this, be sure to check out the Sailrite website or subscribe to the Sailrite YouTube channel. When subscribing, be sure to hit the bell so that you're notified of new videos when they become available. I'm Eric Grant, and from all of us here at Sailrite, thanks for watching.